Hola, bon dia. Soc el Josep Recasens i en aquesta entrevista el doctor Tim Meijers tractarà la qüestió ètica de tenir fills davant el problema ecològic. Veurem què té a dir l'ètica respecte a la decisió de tenir fills en aquesta situació i en quines condicions tindríem motius per a tenir o no tenir fills. També comentarem breument el seu article Climate Change and the Right to One Child i a més d'altres consideracions filosòfiques. El doctor Tim Meijers és doctor en filosofia amb la tesi Justice in Procreation sota la direcció d'Axel Gosseris i actualment és professor de filosofia moral i política a la Universitat de Leiden. A més, ha sigut professor visitant a universitats com la d'Oxford o la d'Aarhus. En els seus articles i llibres tracta temes com la justícia entre generacions, la justícia global o l'ètica familiar, a més de temes de drets reproductius. És membre de diferents organitzacions i sobretot vull destacar la que ens interessa més pel nostre tema, que és membre de la xarxa europea Demography, Ethics and Public Policy. Tracten també molts temes de demografia i d'ètica al voltant de tenir fills. Us recomano molt seguir el seu perfil i us deixo amb l'entrevista. Abans d'això vull agrair al doctor Meijers l'oportunitat per entrevistar-lo i la seva paciència i espero que us sigui de profit. Us animo també a veure les altres entrevistes que he realitzat experts en aquest problema ètic de tenir fills davant la crisi ecològica i espero que us sigui de profit. Gràcies.
Well, thank you, Professor Meijers. Tim. Well, the first question I would like to formulate is that why having children could be considered an ethical problem.
Yes. Yeah, so you might wonder about this, right? You may think having kids is a very private decision that concerns you and, of course, your partner, and not others. Huh? So why should there be ethical principles to deal with this kind of question? So it seems to me that having kids is not really a private decision because it affects many other people. Of course, it affects yourselves and it affects your partner, but it also affects the people around you. It affects the people who you live with, because you're creating costs for others when you have kids, because kids are not like cars. Kids are rights bearers. So as soon as the child exists, the child has rights and claims on others. So when you are having children, you are creating rights bearers. So you're creating obligations for other people. So the decision affects yourself, but it also affects those around you. And finally, of course, it also affects the child. You bring a person, a rights bearer, into existence. That seems to me that a decision which has such a profound impact on other people's lives, and not just superficial impact, but for the child, it's its very existence at stake. It seems to me that we need ethical principles to deal with decisions like this.
Perfect. Well, I would like also to ask in which ways could be ethically problematic and why the ecological problem requires a special ethical treatment of this problem.
So I guess we all know that the way that we're living right now is as a species is not sustainable. So we need to do things to make sure that our impact on the planet becomes smaller and therefore sustainable. And we can try to do that in several different ways, right? So one way would be to consume much less. The other way would be to introduce technologies that make sure that we can consume without polluting or consume without digging into our natural reserves. And the third way is to make sure that the human population doesn't expand or maybe even starts shrinking. That way we can collectively try as a species to start living within the limits of what our planet can sustainably provide. Now, these limits are flexible, so the green technology would allow us to expand the limits of what we can do within the limits of our planet. But we have to find a way to live sustainably as a species. So there you already have the question. So what role does population play in this? Now, some people think that it's the most important thing, that we should just make sure that we shrink our population and that will solve our problem. I don't think that's true. So if population has a role to play in finding a way to live sustainably, it has to be a relatively small role, and it has to be a role in the long term. Because even if you limit procreation today, this will only have an effect on how many people there are, and it will only have an effect on how much as a species we use in a couple of decades. Right? Demography is slow. So fertility levels now are much lower than they were 20 or 30 years ago, and still more children are being born than 20 or 30 years ago. Why is that? Because the largest generation ever born is having children now. And even though they have less children than people 30 years ago, there's still a lot of children. Sorry. So population can be the only solution, and it can be the solution that we use to solve our issues now. So for that, we need to look to other things. But it is one variable we have to think about when trying to make the world sustainable in the long run. So that's where I see the role for population in questions about sustainability. It's the long game. It's not the short-term solution, but it's a factor that we have to take into account when thinking about living sustainably.
Perfect. Thank you. Very interesting. Well, the other question will be if there are any reasons to have children at all. I mean, is it something rational to have children?
That's a good question. So the first thing, of course, one needs to say here, it's only rational if you want children. So I don't think it's rational to have kids when you don't want kids. Certain things are rational to want even if you don't really want it. So I suppose that it makes sense to say that it's rational to want healthy food. Even if we don't want healthy food, we can still say that it's good for us to have healthy food, even if you would rather have pizza or fries or whatever. So I don't think procreation is like that, where people say, I don't want kids. I don't want to go up to them and say, but you're just mistaken about what's really good for you. So that's not my view. I think that if people want children, this desire makes sense, because procreation gives, and procreation partially, mostly, I think parenthood is more important. The step that sometimes follows after procreation, but that you can also become a parent in a different way than by procreating. But it makes sense for people to want to be parents, because parent-child relationships are special kinds of relationship that give you access to justice relevant goods, to those things that we care about from the point of view of justice. By having children, you can engage in long-term loving relationships. I think it's important that people are in a position where they can engage in such relationships. We acquire responsibility over other human beings. I think it's important that we have access to positions where we can exercise a role like this. It allows us to extend something of ourselves into the future, beyond the limits of our own lives. And I think it's important that we can do that. So I think it makes sense that people want children. And I think that the goods that are at stake in procreation and parenthood are important goods. But it's only rational. It's a plan in life, and it's a special kind of plan in life, but it's not a plan that you have to engage in. So maybe you can compare it to certain types of jobs. So there are certain types of jobs that give a lot of fulfillment, that come with a lot of responsibility. And we don't say that everyone should want those jobs, but we think that it's important for those people who want those kind of positions that they have a fair chance of acquiring that kind of position. And so that's the kind of parallel I would draw here. So it makes sense to want it, but it also makes sense to not want it. But for those people who want it, I think it's important that we think about providing as democratic and as fair access to this opportunity as possible.
But then what is the difference between having children or having any other preference that makes your life good, such as climbing mountains or buying clothes?
Yeah, so not all preferences are equal, I suppose. So certain preferences are just flat preferences, like desire for pizza or desire for fancy clothes. Or I don't think I would put mountaineering at the same level as those things. So mountaineering, I suppose, is a way to stay healthy. So it's exercise, and it's important for us to stay healthy. It's a way to experience natural beauty, to feel one with nature. I'm not a mountaineer myself, so I don't know exactly what the goods at stake are, but I wouldn't say that that's just another preference, but I think the kind of things that we get access to through mountaineering are things that we can also get access through in other ways. So we don't need we don't need mountaineering specifically in order to get access to the things that mountaineering provides us access to. And there are other ways to feel one with nature. There are other ways to exercise. There are other ways to engage in well, you know, the kind of things that people love about mountaineering. And I think that for procreation, the case is a bit harder to make. So it's not clear that there is a replacement activity, so that it's a substitutable activity. We can say, oh, but if you can't have kids, why don't you know, just buy a few hamsters or rabbits? I mean, that seems off, right? So it seems that for those people who want to parent, it's not clear that there's an alternative route to the goods of parenthood. Whereas for mountaineering, even though it's not true that mountaineering is just a trivial thing, but it's a thing that gives access to important things that you can also get access through in other ways. So that I think what makes procreation, or I should again say procreation and parenthood, because I actually don't think procreation is that important. Maybe we can talk about that later. I think the parenthood is a really important bit, and usually we acquire parental rights by procreation, but again, there are other ways, and for some people procreation is not even an option. And yeah, but that's for me the difference. So some preferences are just preferences, they're not particularly valuable at all, and then there are many things which are valuable, but are valuable like other things are valuable, so they are in a way substitutable, and some things are not substitutable, right? Like parenthood, or like having a meaningful job. That's another thing that I don't think you can just replace with something else.
Thank you. Very interesting. Well, the next question is about the predictions that scientists have made about the ecological problem and the population problem, that we could arrive at the stage of overpopulation at some point. And then the question is, why should we consider limiting the number of children as a solution? I mean, why limiting the number? This question touches something that we said before, that I think that this could be an excuse to reduce the to not reduce the consumerist way of life in the rich countries, and it could be also a way of blaming the poor countries that are the ones that have more children.
Good. So I think those are very important worries. So that's why I ask, what is it that worries you about this? And I think so. Always when I write about procreation, I try to make sure that nothing I say, and this is something I'm very conscious of, that nothing I say can be used to say, you see, the problem is with people in Africa who just keep on having kids, right? So I would be devastated if something that I said would be used or interpreted as supporting a position like that. So again, that's why I don't think population is a short-term solution. So putting the blame with high fertility countries for our sustainability challenge is just, it's a mistake on many levels. First of all, it's a factual mistake, because even if people in, say, Somalia would start having less kids, this would not make a difference to our emissions. It would not change the impact of humanity as a whole, because people born in Somalia over their lifetimes, they emit very little, they pollute very little. And whereas children born in the US or in Germany, they pollute much, much more. If you take the extremes, the difference will be about 70 times. So Americans pollute 70 times as much as the lowest emitting country in the world, but I forgot right now which country that was. It's also a moral mistake, because why? So what, if we look at the social scientific literature, what explains that people have so many children in low income countries? And a lot of the determinants of fertility, a lot of the things that drive high fertility have to do with poverty and gender inequality. So the poor, or the least well-off, tend to have more children than people who are richer, and people with more opportunities tend to have fewer children than people with lesser opportunities. And this is understandable. So saying that the problem lies with high fertility countries is, for me, it's like blaming the victim. We together uphold an international system that is that means that some people are very rich and other people are very poor, and then you show up and you start blaming the poor people for the things that they do because they are poor. So I definitely, it shouldn't be our first line of defense. Like I said before, we should look at other things. We should look at decreasing consumption. We should focus on coming up with green technology. But importantly, because we also have to keep the long game in mind, we have to remember that it's not just about the next 20 years. The next 20 years are very important, but it's not just about the next 20 years. We also have to make sure that our world population, that everyone in the world can live a good life. And the larger the population is, the more difficult that might become. So we do have to try to make sure that fertility levels in Africa do drop. But how do you do that? You don't do that by repressive policies. You don't do that by blaming people, saying, stop having children. That's not how it works. What you have to make sure is that that over there as well, we find a way to get economic development going in a sustainable way. We have to make sure that we promote the position of women in those societies by making sure there are good schools, by making sure that we support African states, for example, in setting up pension systems, setting up welfare systems. And so, I think that we in Europe have a double responsibility. One, our responsibility is to make sure that we develop our economies in our societies in a sustainable way. And the second responsibility is one to the rest of the world. We have to make sure that we combat inequality. So we have to engage in redistribution globally as well, and make sure that others can live decent lives, but can live decent lives sustainably. So we have to invest, and that's not just economic investment, but that also means in making sure that people have secure livelihoods, and that girls have good perspectives in lives. And if we do that, fertility levels will drop.
Thank you. Yeah, and talking about this responsibility, some people think that the responsibility on limiting the numbers of people should be a state's responsibility or a public administration responsibility. Who has this responsibility, and what will be the difference between an ethical and political responsibility?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I agree with those people who say, at least those people who say, that primarily the responsibility should lie with institutions. What we should be primarily interested in is changing the way that our societies, but also changing the ways that our global system is set up, right? So the problem is primarily systemic. That relates to what I just said. So in order to make sure that fertility levels drop, we need to do things that we need to do anyway, namely make sure that everyone on the planet can live a decent life. And I can't do that, and you can do that as individuals. That's something that needs to be done collectively and engaging everyone. And it needs to be done, it needs to be a structural change, not just the way that you and I behave as individuals. So the most important challenge is the institutional one. I agree, but that doesn't mean that individuals don't have any responsibilities, right? So if, for the time being, institutions are not doing what they should be doing, but here in the Netherlands and in Spain, I'm sure it's for many people it's the same, and in the US it's the same. We have the option of having less children, right? It's not necessary for us to have many children, and we can try as individuals to make more sustainable decisions. Is our individual's decision going to change the world and save the world from climate change? Not at all, right? But that doesn't mean that it can be wrong to act in ways that disregard the situation that we find ourselves in, right? So that's the personal ethic bit, is asking yourself the question, so what can I ask from the people around me? What can I ask from future generations when it comes to realizing my plans? Can I impose these extra costs on them? Is there a justification for that? Or am I now taking more than my fair share? Right? Even if an institution is not prohibiting you from taking more than your fair share, it's still wrong to take more than your fair share. Huh? So make an analogy with poverty. Poverty is also something that is best addressed structurally and institutionally. But that doesn't mean that we can shrug our shoulders when we can do something about poverty and say, ah, yeah, but that's a structural problem. It's for institutions to solve, not my problem. Thank you, goodbye. I don't think it works that way, right?
Perfect. Yeah, the next question will be, what exactly are the arguments to justify the unethical limitation of the number of children? Or about what philosophical arguments do you consider more important to establish this ethical limitation? Because maybe I'm wrong, but I don't consider saying if we have a lot of children, there will be problems. Very strong philosophical argument. At least.
Yes. So yes. That's. I think you're right. I think you're right, because as I just said, me having 6 children changes nothing in the world, right? So, you know, my individual decisions are completely irrelevant when it comes to the consequences of climate change, right? So whether I decide to live my life childless, as a vegetarian, never flying, only riding my bike, living in a small house, or whether I spend my life driving a Hummer, eating steaks, having 25 children and flying to Barcelona every week, that's not going to change anything, right? So in terms of consequences, right? So if you just look at the consequences of my actions, okay, Tim, he emits a lot. Why is it wrong? Well, we can't say, because that causes climate change, because, you know, there are how many people are there in the world by now? More than 7 billion, and my individual actions, they don't make a significant difference. So we have to look elsewhere. And I think there are a few arguments you could give, and one is one that I just mentioned, which is fairness. So this is a problem that we need to solve together, and this means that if we want everyone to have their fair share, us, the current generation, but also future generations, we need to spend a little bit less now. We have to make sure that we don't use too much. So by taking more than your fair share, you're leaving less for future generations. Now, the fact that your individual decision doesn't change much, doesn't change the fact that you're now acting unfairly. You're taking more than you are entitled to. You can, if you want, you can put this in terms of the golden rule. You can try to, if you want to be a good Kantian, you can say you have to act in a way that is universalizable. And clearly a rule which says I can do whatever I want environmentally wise is not a universalizable rule. So that would be another way to go if you want to stick to a more traditional Kantian point of view. But I think fairness is an important one as well.
Yeah. Well, maybe just the problem with this idea is that you need to have some kind of theory of justice to say what is a fair share of the resources or something. But yeah,
yes,
I consider
definitely, yes, yeah, and this is always going to be a problem, of course. I agree with you here. So, but so people are going to disagree about this. Fine. I'm not so worried about that, because I'm pretty sure that upon reflection, most people will agree that doing whatever is not okay. Right? So that's going to be an implausible theory of justice. So whether you are a sufficientarian or an egalitarian, I don't think that matters that much. Even if you're a sufficientarian, you're gonna think, okay, but we should leave enough for future generations, and then we already have to make sure that we don't spend too much now. And so only if you're a complete nihilist and you don't care about anything. But then, even then, I don't think that's a very plausible position, because in the paper that you read, I also talk about the importance that future generations have for our plans in life, right? So even if you're just interested in you, and if you think that you can be an ethical egoist, for example, there are still reasons not to act indifferently with regards to future generations. They might not be moral reasons anymore. They might be prudential reasons or reasons of self-interest. But it would still, I think, be very difficult to defend an ethical position where you say, what we do to the environment doesn't matter at all. I just don't think that's a coherent position.
Thank you. Very interesting. So once we accept that there should be an ethical limitation of this number of children we have, I think that the most important idea is to consider a non-arbitrary limitation of this number. So
yes.
In your article, Climate Change and the Right to One Child, you defend that we should have one child per couple. So I want to ask you if you could explain this position, and if you still defend it, or what are your views on this issue?
Yeah, I don't defend the position, and I never defended the position that you should have only one child. What I defended, the position that I defend in this paper, but you're not the first one to say this, so maybe I should have formulated it more clearly. My position is the following: given the importance of parent-child relationship, people have a very strong entitlement to at least one child. It's a defeasible entitlement, because there might be, like, if we're like in a super urgent environmental crisis and we need to reduce the number of people right now, it might be the case that one child is not possible. But I think we should really try our best going forward to find a strategy which allows people to have at least one child. Now, if we discover ways to generate energy that don't pollute, and ways of producing that don't pollute, and if we find ways to sustain 15 billion people on the planet in a sustainable way, I'm not attached to the one-child limit at all. But I think there's something special about the first child. So having one child, either by procreation or otherwise, but having one child to parent gives you access to the goods of parenthood. A second child doesn't do that. Right, so there is a qualitative difference, if you like, between the first and the second child. Now, the first child makes you a parent, and the second child doesn't make you a parent. Of course, there are all sorts of other valuable things at stake there. For example, fraternal relationships, sibling relationships, the family dynamics change. So there's something valuable at having a second child, but what's at stake is different. So think of a silly analogy again. So suppose that you want to move around in Barcelona, and an excellent way to do that is by getting a bike. Moving around is very important, so we get you a bike. And now you have a bike, and now you're mobile, right? You can move around. And then we say, what about a second bike? And then you say, yeah, maybe that's nice, a second bike, and maybe that's valuable to have like a spare bike, or to have a whatever. But it doesn't give you the same thing as the first bike. The first bike gave you mobility, and the second bike might give you all sorts of other things, but it doesn't give you mobility. And the first child gives you access to parent-child relationships, and the second child doesn't make you a parent, because you were already a parent. So that's why I think this entitlement, so I think it would be nice if people could have more kids, but the right to the second child is more easily defeasible than the right to the first child.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
So I think that, and then there's no arbitrary line. it's a very annoying answer because it has a lot of conditions. So you say it's a right, but it's a defeasible right, but it's not very easily overridden. The second, maybe it's also fine. It's more easily overridden, and you need to talk about, the circumstances in which. So it's an annoying answer. I agree, but it's not an arbitrary answer.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I want to ask you something related to this later, but now I also wanted to ask to you that Christine overall in Why Have Children, Why, in his book, argues that it is problematic to defend the idea of one child per couple because it could not work with the new forms of reproduction or the new types of families.
Yeah.
So how these different types of family or new forms of reproduction could affect to this limitation?
It can go several ways. So maybe, so I don't know whether this is the case in the world at the moment because I'm not a climate scientist, but maybe it's the case that one child per couple is too much, and maybe that's not something we can manage in the long run. And then alternative types of family might be a solution, because it might very well be that with 3 parents you can have access to the goods of parenthood with 1 child, or 4. Probably it stops there, right? Because something changes about the dynamics. So I don't think you can share a kid with 10 people. I don't think you can, not each adult individual can have a parent-child relationship with a child if there are so many parents. But in principle, it seems to me that there's nothing special about the number of having 2 parents. It could be 3. Many people have 3 or 4 parents, and people with whom they really have a parent-child relationship. So I'm not sure this is a challenge for my view. So again, what matters to me is that people have access to the goods of parenthood, and I'm not attached to the nuclear family as is now the dominant form of living together as a family. That's one way of doing things. There are many other ways of doing things, and that's fine. What matters, if we look at parent-child relationships, is that people who want to be parents have access to the goods of parenthood, and it doesn't really matter what the family setup is for that.
Yeah. Well, I was just asking this question because to me, it is in some sense problematic that you have a right to 1 child, but at the same time, you cannot create a child alone. Well, in most cases, you always need another person. So
yes, well, yeah. So yes, but of course there are implications, right? For example, for people who want to be single parents. So I think it makes sense. So it doesn't have to be a child per couple. I also want the single parent to have access to the goods of parenthood, right? So they have a right as strong as the rights of the other individuals to have a child. And insofar as it's the job of the state to make sure that we have access to the things that make our lives good, I certainly think that's the job of the state. The state also has to facilitate access to parenthood to these people, for example, by helping them in adoption procedures, etc.
Thank you.
Yeah. So yeah. So yeah.
Yeah, and
but well, I can see why it would be easy to read my piece as being about couples, because we talk about procreation, and so that's sort of the image we have in mind. But you're totally right. That's not the only way of founding a family, and I'm in no way particularly attached to that particular way of organizing the family.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah. The last question I wanted to ask you is that if there are other ethical obligations that parents may have if they decide to have children, apart from limiting the number of children.
Loads, right? So so parent-child relationships are the kind of relationships that can only exist in a meaningful way if the parents acquire and act on a very large set of obligations towards their children. Right, so parents are the primary caregivers to the children, and they have to make sure that the children are doing well, that they're well fed, that they stay out of danger, that they. So of course, others have obligations to the kids as well, but the parents have like a sort of special duty in that regard to the children. But maybe you have in mind duties toward third parties, so to raise the kids in particular ways. Yes, yeah. I guess you have to try to raise them as good people, and insofar as limiting consumption is a part of that, you have to try to teach them that. I also think that we have sort of negative obligations. There are certain things that we shouldn't do to our children. So we shouldn't, for example, try to enroll them completely in our view of the good life, right? So we shouldn't. I don't think it's right to force children into a religious doctrine, for example. We should raise our children freely in the sense that they can set out their own plans in life and try to come up with their own conception of the good, which might be the same as ours, but it's unlikely. Yeah, but we certainly their conception of the good will share some of the elements of that's inevitable, of living together, of being a family together. They will come to value some of the same things that parents value, but I don't think we should force them into a particular conception of the good life. So that's a negative obligation, to try to not to force your children to live their lives in a particular way, but to raise them as autonomous beings who can freely decide on what kind of plan in life to embrace. But I don't think ecological considerations are part of a conception of the good life. They are the demands of right. So we owe it to others, and we owe it to future generations to act in more sustainable ways. And so I don't think that's problematic in that regard.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for all your answers. And if you agree, we could stop the interview here.
Yes.
But I
Thank
will
you.